The hall was built for creatures twice my height, and every one of them was looking down at me. I stood at the center of the Karathi court, a raised platform of black glass, surrounded by nobles whose skin shimmered like oil on water. The air smelled of ozone and something sweet I could not name. Above me, banners the size of ships hung from a ceiling I could barely see. This was the throne room of the Karathi Dominion, a civilization that had conquered 11 worlds before humanity had learned to fly. And in front of me, seated on a throne carved from a single fallen star, was Princess Saren Val. She was young for her people, barely into her first century, but she carried herself like she had already won every war she would ever fight. Her eyes were a pale violet, sharp and amused, the eyes of someone who had never once been told no. "So this is the ambassador," she said, her voice carrying easily through the enormous chamber. "This is what Earth sent us." I said nothing. I had learned, a long time ago, that silence made people like her uncomfortable in ways that words never could. She rose from her throne and walked toward me, her robes trailing behind her like smoke. The court went quiet. Somewhere behind me, I heard my own ambassador, Owen Marsh, shift nervously in his seat. He had told me before we boarded this ship, "Do not provoke her, do not embarrass her, do not give her a reason." I had told him I would try. "Do you know," Saren said, circling me slowly, "how many species have stood where you are standing and begged for mercy?" "I imagine quite a few," I said. A ripple of surprise moved through the court. Apparently, I was supposed to be quieter than that. 11, she said. 11 worlds. 11 species who thought they mattered until they met us. And do you know what all of them had in common? Human. I'm sure you're about to tell me. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She was not used to being interrupted, and she was even less used to being unbothered. "They wasted our time," she said. "They sent envoys who thought they could negotiate. They sent generals who thought they could fight. In the end, it made no difference. We ended each of them in less time than it takes your species to finish a single meal." She stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint patterns moving beneath her skin, like circuitry made of light. "I could end you in a minute," she said. "Right here, in front of your entire delegation, I could show every human watching this broadcast exactly how little your species means to us, and nothing you say, nothing you do, would change that." The room was silent. I could feel Owen Marsh holding his breath somewhere behind me. I could feel a dozen cameras, human and Karathi both, recording every second of this for 2 different worlds. I looked at her for a long moment. "You could try," I said. The court gasped. It was a small sound, but in that vast silent hall, it carried like thunder. Saren's expression flickered, just for an instant, something between surprise and anger. "You dare," she said quietly. "I'm not daring anything," I said. "I'm telling you the truth. You could try to end me in a minute. I don't think you'd manage it, but you're welcome to try." For a moment, I thought she might actually order it done right there, in front of the cameras, in front of the watching worlds. Her hand moved slightly toward the guards stationed along the walls, tall armored figures with weapons built into their arms. Then, instead, she laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had decided that mercy was a better punishment than force, because it let her keep humiliating me a little longer. 60 seconds, she said, turning to address the court, raising her voice so the cameras would catch every word. "I will give this human 60 seconds. Let it use them however it wishes. Let it beg, let it threaten, let it stand there in silence, like it is doing now. When the minute ends, everyone watching, on every world in the Dominion, and on that small blue rock you call home, will understand exactly what humanity is worth." She turned back to me, her violet eyes glittering with something close to delight. "You'll be gone in a minute, human," she said. "Make your last words count." I did not answer right away. I let the silence stretch, let it fill the enormous chamber, let every alien noble lean forward just slightly to see what I would do. Then I glanced past her, toward an older Karathi standing near the throne, a man in dark gray robes with a rank insignia I recognized from briefing files. General Draven Kest, head of Dominion Military Intelligence, the man responsible for compiling everything the Karathi knew about Earth. General Kest, I said, my voice calm and even. You wrote the report on Meridian Colony, didn't you? The one your people destroyed 11 years ago. Something shifted in Draven Kest's face. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people in that room would have missed entirely. But I was not most people, and I had spent a long time learning to read expressions that were not built for human faces. It was recognition. And underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. You wrote that Meridian was insignificant, I continued, still looking at him, still ignoring the princess entirely, which I could see was beginning to irritate her more than anything I had said so far. You wrote that its destruction would send a message. You wrote that message down as a footnote in a report that was maybe 4 pages long. What is this? Saren demanded, glancing between us. What are you talking about? Draven Kest did not answer her. He was still looking at me, and now there was something in his eyes that had not been there a moment ago. Something careful, something that understood, even if he could not yet say why, that a mistake had been made somewhere, a long time ago, and that mistake was standing in front of the throne wearing a diplomat's uniform. You should have written more than 4 pages, I said quietly. You should have asked who survived. The chamber had gone very still. Even the princess, for the first time since I had walked into that room, looked uncertain. Your minute is running, I said, glancing at the clock she had summoned onto a floating display beside her throne, its numbers already counting down. You might want to use it more carefully than you think. 58 seconds remained. Nobody in that room, not the princess, not the general, not the 11 conquered species watching from their homeworlds through the broadcast, understood yet what those 58 seconds would actually cost them. But I did. I had known, from the very first second I stepped onto this ship, exactly how this was going to end. I just had not expected to enjoy watching them find out quite this much. 11 years earlier, I had been a boy of 16, standing in the wheat fields of Meridian Colony, watching the sky turn orange in the middle of the afternoon. Meridian was not a large settlement. It held perhaps 40,000 people, mostly farmers and engineers, spread across a handful of towns built along a wide river valley. It was the kind of place that never made the news back on Earth, the kind of place people forgot existed until something happened to it. Something happened to it on a Tuesday in early autumn. I remember the sound before I remember anything else, a low hum that grew louder and louder until it was not a sound anymore but a pressure, something you felt in your teeth and your chest, rather than heard with your ears. My older sister, Grace, grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the storm shelter our father had built into the hillside behind our house, the same shelter he had built for tornadoes and never once thought we would need for anything else. We made it inside, just as the first strike hit the town center, 3 kilometers away. I did not see it happen. I only felt the ground shake, and heard my mother start praying in a language I did not know she remembered. The Karathi ships did not land. They did not send soldiers to walk among the ruins. They simply passed overhead, twice, and left behind a message broadcast on every frequency the colony used, a message that said, in flat mechanical translation, that Meridian had failed to pay a resource tribute the Dominion had never actually informed anyone existed, and that this was the consequence. By the time the ships were gone, 9,000 people were dead. General Draven Kest, I would learn many years later, wrote exactly 4 pages about what had happened. He called it a demonstration. He called it efficient. He did not know that in the wreckage of that colony, a group of survivors, engineers and soldiers, and ordinary people who had lost everything, decided that this would never happen to another human world again. He did not know they built something out of the ashes, something quiet and patient, something that would take more than a decade to finish. He did not know my name. I was recruited into that program 4 years after Meridian burned. It did not have a grand name, not at first. Later, people would call it Ashfall, because that was what most of us remembered most clearly, ash falling from a sky that should have been blue. It was not a military unit, in the way most people understand the word. It was something closer to a promise, made by a small number of people who had decided that humanity's greatest weakness, the fact that we always underestimated ourselves and let others underestimate us too, was also the only advantage we had left. We trained for things no other human program had ever trained for. Not simply combat, though there was plenty of that, but something more difficult. We trained to understand the Korathi and the 10 other species they had conquered, better than they understood themselves. We studied their technology, not to copy it, but to find the places where it could be turned against its makers. We studied their psychology, their pride, the exact shape of the arrogance that let a species conquer 11 worlds and never once ask whether the 12th might be different. Most of what we built in secret, hidden inside systems the Dominion had already stolen or absorbed from other species, so that even their most advanced sensors would see nothing but old, familiar code. We did not build fleets. Fleets could be seen. We built something smaller and far more patient. By the time I turned 26, I had a new name in 3 different Korathi intelligence databases, none of them my own, and a role that had nothing to do with weapons or war. I became a diplomat, not because I believed in diplomacy the way Owen Marsh did, with his careful optimism and his genuine hope that humanity could talk its way into peace, but because a diplomat was allowed to go places a soldier never could. A diplomat could stand in the middle of a Korathi flagship, surrounded by their entire command structure, and nobody would think twice about where he had been the day before, or the year before that, or what exactly he carried with him when he boarded. I was not sent to Sarenval's court by accident. I volunteered for it the moment the invitation arrived, 3 months earlier, requesting a human envoy to attend a ceremonial audience aboard the Korathi flagship Arun's Wrath. Most of my superiors argued against it. It was too dangerous, they said. The Korathi had a long history of using these audiences to humiliate the species they considered beneath them, and there was no guarantee I would be allowed to leave afterward. I told them that was exactly why I needed to be there. What none of them knew, not even Owen Marsh, who had spent the entire trip believing I was simply a very calm and very stubborn negotiator, was what I had spent the last 11 years building toward. Ashfall was never about winning a war through force. We had run the numbers 1,000 times, and against the full might of the Dominion's fleet, humanity could not win a war of ships and soldiers, not for decades yet, maybe not ever. What we could win, if we were patient enough, was a war fought entirely inside the enemy's confidence. Every Korathi flagship ran on a command architecture that had been copied, with only minor changes, from the very first species they had ever conquered nearly 3 centuries ago. It was old, deeply trusted, and almost never audited, because the Dominion had long since stopped believing anyone could threaten a system that had served them so well for so long. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of weakness a species obsessed with strength would never think to look for. I had spent 4 years learning that architecture, as well as the engineers who built it. I had spent 2 more years finding a way inside it that would leave no trace until the moment it was needed. And I had spent the final months before this audience making absolutely certain that when the moment came, it would not simply disable a single ship or jam a single weapon. It would reach every vessel in the Arun's Wrath battle group, all at once, the instant I gave the signal. I did not know, when I boarded that ship 3 days earlier, that Princess Sarenval would decide to give me a countdown of exactly 60 seconds in front of every camera in the Dominion. I could not have planned for that particular detail. But I had planned, carefully and patiently, for almost every version of this moment that I could imagine, including the one where she decided to make an example of me in front of the watching worlds. Because I understood something that General Draven Kest, for all his reports and all his footnotes, had never bothered to write down. A species that survives the destruction of one of its worlds does not become weaker. It becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes patient in exactly the way conquerors like the Korathi never learned to be, because conquerors have never needed patience. They have only ever needed force, and force had always been enough, right up until the moment it was not. Standing in that throne room, listening to the numbers count down on the floating display beside Saren Val's throne, I was not afraid. I had been afraid once, a long time ago, in a storm shelter dug into a hillside while the sky burned orange above me. I had promised myself, in that shelter, that I would never feel that particular kind of helplessness again. 58 seconds had already become 40 by the time my thoughts returned fully to the room around me. Saren was still watching me, her expression caught somewhere between irritation and curiosity, clearly unsettled by whatever she had seen pass between me and General Kest, but not yet understanding why. She did not know that her countdown was not really hers at all. It was mine. It always had been. And in exactly 40 seconds, everyone in that chamber, and everyone watching from 11 conquered worlds, was going to learn exactly what humanity had built in the years since Meridian burned. 39 seconds. Saren Val lifted a hand, and the floating numbers beside her throne grew larger, so that everyone in the chamber and everyone watching the broadcast could see the countdown clearly. She wanted this moment remembered. She wanted every conquered world to see exactly how small humanity could be made to look, right down to the final second. "You had something clever to say about General Kest," she said, circling me again, her voice pitched to carry. "Was that meant to frighten me? A story about a colony my people erased over a decade ago. Do you understand how many colonies we have erased, human? Do you understand how little that story means to anyone standing in this room?" "It doesn't need to mean anything to you," I said. "It only needed to mean something to us." 30 seconds, she said, ignoring me, raising her voice further. "In 30 seconds, this broadcast will end, and every world watching will understand that Earth sent its very best, and its very best could do nothing but talk." I glanced toward Owen Marsh, seated with the rest of our small delegation along the edge of the chamber. His face was pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He did not know what I had spent 11 years building. He did not know what was about to happen. All he knew was that the woman in front of him had just given a public countdown to his colleague's execution, and there was nothing he could do about it. I gave him the smallest possible nod. It was not much, but it was enough, because Owen Marsh was smarter than most people gave him credit for, and I had told him once, months ago, during a quiet moment on the journey out here, that if I ever gave him that particular signal, he should simply trust that everything was going exactly as planned. He straightened slightly in his chair. It was enough. 20 seconds, Saren said. I felt it then, the faint change in the ship's systems that only someone who had spent years learning to feel it would ever notice. A shift in the background hum of the chamber, so small that even the Korathi engineers monitoring the ship from its control decks would not register it as anything more than routine fluctuation. It was the signal taking hold, not activating yet, simply arriving, quietly, in every system connected to the ancient command architecture I had spent years learning to navigate. Waiting for the final second of the countdown, the moment Saren herself had chosen to do exactly what I had built it to do. 15 seconds, she said, and now there was real delight in her voice, the delight of someone who believed she was about to win completely and permanently in front of an audience of 11 worlds. "You should know," I said quietly, "that I did not come here to convince you of anything. I came here because you were going to give me this exact moment, whether you meant to or not." 10 seconds, she said, though I could see, just faintly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Something about my tone had finally reached her, some instinct older than her pride, telling her that a creature about to lose everything should not sound this calm. 9. General Draven Kest took a small step forward, his eyes still fixed on me, his earlier recognition sharpening into something closer to alarm. He had spent his career studying humanity from a distance, writing reports nobody questioned, and some part of him, buried under decades of confidence, was beginning to understand that he had missed something enormous. 8. 7. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second, not out of fear, but because I wanted my first sight of what came next to be deliberate, chosen, calm. I thought of the wheat fields of Meridian, the orange sky, my sister's hand gripping my arm as we ran for the shelter. I thought of 11 years of quiet work, done by people whose names would never appear in any Dominion report, building something that had waited patiently for exactly this moment. 6. 5. Around the chamber, I felt more than saw the first small changes begin. A guard near the far wall glanced down at the weapon built into his arm, his expression shifting from boredom to confusion as its status display flickered and went dark. Another guard reached toward a communication panel on the wall, only to find it unresponsive beneath his fingers. 4. Saren had not yet noticed. She was too focused on me, too certain that whatever happened next would be exactly what she had planned. Her hand rose slightly, a gesture toward the guards along the wall, an unspoken order to be ready. None of them would be ready for what was actually coming. 3. I opened my eyes. 2. You should check your ship, Princess, I said, my voice calm and even, cutting cleanly through the tension of the chamber. I think you'll find it isn't entirely yours anymore. 1, she said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty, some instinct finally catching up to the strangeness in the room. And then the countdown reached 0, and the entire Aran's Wrath, along with every ship in its battle group, went quiet all at once. It did not happen with fire or with force. There was no explosion, no alarm, nothing that would have looked dramatic to anyone expecting violence. Instead, every screen in the chamber, every weapon system, every engine core across an entire battle group of 11 ships simply stopped responding to Karathi command in the same instant. The great floating countdown display above Saren's throne flickered, and instead of showing 0, it began displaying something else entirely, a simple message, written in clean Karathi script that I had spent months preparing exactly for this moment. Meridian Colony, 9,000 names, remembered. Beneath it, the names themselves began to scroll, slowly, deliberately, filling the enormous display that every camera in the room, and every camera on 11 conquered worlds, was still broadcasting live. The chamber erupted into chaos, though it was a strange, contained kind of chaos, the chaos of powerful people suddenly discovering they had no power at all. Guards along the wall struck uselessly at weapons that would not respond. Officers at nearby control stations pressed frantically at panels that gave them nothing but silence in return. Somewhere deep in the ship, I knew, an entire crew of engineers was discovering that every engine, every life support system, every defensive shield was still running exactly as it should, still keeping everyone aboard safe and breathing, but utterly deaf to any Karathi command. I had made certain of that detail above all others. Nobody aboard that ship was going to be harmed. That had never been the point. The point was something far simpler and far more devastating to a species that had built its entire identity around never losing control of anything. The point was to show them, all at once, in front of every world they had ever conquered, that control itself was an illusion they had never actually earned. Saren Val stood frozen in front of her throne, staring up at the scrolling names, her violet eyes wide, her earlier confidence completely gone. For the first time since I had walked into that chamber, she looked, more than anything else, young. "What is this?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything to your ship, Princess," I said. "Your ship is fine. Everyone aboard it is fine. I simply reminded it who actually understands it best. General Draven Kest had gone very still, his eyes moving rapidly between the scrolling names and me, some final piece of understanding finally settling into place. Ashfall, he said quietly, almost to himself. The reports. There were rumors, years ago, of a human program with that name, but our analysts dismissed it as unlikely. A myth, a story told by frightened colonists. Your analysts were wrong, I said. A great many of your analysts have been wrong, for a very long time, about a great many things concerning my species. Saren turned toward Draven Kest, something desperate entering her voice for the first time. Fix this, she said. Whatever this is, fix it, now. I cannot fix what I do not understand, Your Highness, he said quietly, and for the first time in the entire audience, he did not sound like a man addressing his princess. He sounded like a man addressing an equal, someone who had finally realized the danger of the room they were standing in together. This was not a simple intrusion. This has been sitting inside our own architecture for longer than I can currently determine. It is not attacking us. It is simply choosing, at this exact moment, not to obey us. Then order it to obey, Saren said, her voice rising, the first cracks of real fear showing beneath her anger. It was never yours to order, I said quietly. That was the mistake, all of it. Every report, every audience like this one, every colony your people erased without a second thought. You believed control was something you simply had, permanently, because you had always had it before. You never once considered that it might be something you were only ever borrowing. The chamber had gone almost completely silent now, the earlier chaos settling into something far more unsettling, a kind of held breath shared by every Karathi in the room. Above us, the names continued scrolling, unhurried, patient, exactly as they had been programmed to do. 9,000 names. It would take several minutes to display them all. I looked at Saren Val, standing in front of her own throne, staring up at a list of the dead her empire had made, and then forgotten, and for the first time since I had arrived on this ship, I felt something other than calm. It was not satisfaction, not exactly. It was something quieter and stranger, something closer to relief. For 11 years, the people who built Ashfall had wondered whether this moment would ever actually arrive, whether all that patience and secrecy would ever amount to anything more than a plan that lived only on paper. Standing there, watching the names of my neighbors and my teachers and the family down the road from ours scroll slowly across a Karathi display, broadcast to 11 worlds who had never once been asked to remember what their conquerors had done, I understood, finally and completely, that it had. This is only the beginning of what you need to understand, Princess, I said quietly. You gave me a minute to prove what humanity is worth. I would suggest you use the next several minutes finding out exactly how wrong that number was. The names finished scrolling, 7 minutes later. Nobody in the chamber had moved much in that time. The guards had given up striking at their unresponsive weapons and instead stood frozen at their posts, watching the display along with everyone else, because there was nothing else left for them to do. Officers at the control stations sat with their hands hovering uselessly over panels that no longer answered them. Even Saren Val had stopped speaking, standing motionless in front of her own throne, watching 9,000 names scroll past in a language her people had never bothered to learn. When the last name finally faded, the great display returned to something simpler, a single sentence, written first in Karathi script, then beneath it in English, so that both the watching worlds and the delegation behind me could read it clearly. This is what your empire chose to forget. This is what we chose to remember. Owen Marsh rose slowly from his seat behind me, his earlier fear replaced by something far more complicated, a mixture of shock and something close to pride. He had spent months believing humanity's role in this room was to survive quietly, to negotiate carefully, to avoid giving offense. He was only now beginning to understand that survival had never been the only thing happening behind the scenes. General Draven Kest broke the silence first. "How long?" he said quietly, still staring at the empty display where the names had been. "How long has this been inside our systems?" "Long enough," I said. "That is not an answer." "It's the only one you're going to get, General." He turned to look at me fully, for the first time since the countdown had reached 0, and I could see, clearly now, the shape of the realization moving through him. It was not fear, not exactly, not yet. It was something closer to the specific horror of a man who has spent his entire career being certain of something, only to discover, all at once, that his certainty had been built on nothing at all. "Your reports," I said, before he could ask anything further, "describe humanity as a young species. Fractured, slow to unite, slow to build, slow to understand the scale of what exists beyond our own solar system. All of that was true, once. It was true when your ships first crossed into our system and demanded tribute from a colony that had no idea your empire even existed. It was true when Meridian burned, because we genuinely did not know, at that time, how to answer a threat like yours." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every camera in the room, every world watching, hear exactly what came next. It has not been true for a very long time since. Saren Val finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before, stripped of the confidence that had filled it only minutes earlier. "You let us believe we understood you," she said. "For years, you let every report, every analysis, every audience, like this one, continue believing something you knew was false." "Yes," I said simply. "That was the entire point." "Why?" she said, and for the first time, the question sounded genuine, not performative, not designed for the cameras. "Why let it go on so long? Why not simply tell us, the moment you were strong enough, exactly what you had built?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because it deserved an honest answer, even from someone who had insulted an entire species only minutes earlier and clearly still did not fully grasp the weight of what she had done. "Because strength that announces itself invites attack," I said. "A species that shows its full capability the moment it develops one gives its enemies time to prepare a response. We had already watched what your empire did to species who resisted openly, who tried to match you ship for ship, weapon for weapon. 11 worlds, 11 failures. We were not interested in becoming a 12th. So instead you waited," Draven Kest said slowly, understanding building in his voice, even as it clearly unsettled him further. "You let us believe you were harmless. You let us grow careless. We let you believe exactly what you wanted to believe," I said. "That was never difficult. Your empire has spent 3 centuries conquering species who fit a very particular pattern, proud enough to resist, but never patient enough to wait. We were the first species you encountered who understood the difference between those two things." The chamber remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of a ship that was, technically, still fully operational, still keeping everyone aboard safe, still refusing to answer to anyone but the will of a program built by people who had lost everything and decided, quietly and carefully, to build something that could never be taken from them again. "What happens now?" Saren asked, and I watched something shift in her posture as she said it, a straightening of her shoulders that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the particular kind of courage it takes to ask a question when you already suspect you will not like the answer. "That depends entirely on you," I said. "And on your father, and on whatever remains of your empire's confidence once this broadcast reaches the worlds you conquered. I would imagine several of them are watching this exact moment with a great deal of interest." I saw the realization land fully then, not just in Saren's face, but in the faces of every Karathi officer still standing frozen around the chamber. This audience, meant to humiliate a single human envoy in front of a captive audience of conquered worlds, had instead become something else entirely, a demonstration, broadcast live and unedited, that the Empire's own command systems, the very architecture that had allowed them to conquer 11 species and rule over them for generations, could be rendered useless by a single embedded human intelligence at the exact moment of its choosing. Every world watching had just learned two things simultaneously. First, that humanity was not the fragile, insignificant species the Dominion's reports had described, and second, and far more dangerous for Saren's empire, that the Karathi themselves were not nearly as invincible as 3 centuries of conquest had led everyone, including the Karathi, to believe. "You understand," Draven Kest said quietly, "that this changes everything, not simply between your species and ours, between us and every world we have ever ruled." "I understand that better than you do, General," I said. "I have spent 11 years understanding exactly that." Saren Val looked up at the now empty display, then back at me, and for a moment I saw, beneath the violet eyes and the shimmering skin and the centuries of inherited certainty, something that looked remarkably human. Fear, yes, but also something else. The first faint stirring of genuine respect, forced into existence by a mistake she would spend the rest of her long life trying to fully understand. "You could have taken this ship," she said slowly. "You could have taken far more than this ship, if what you have shown me is even a fraction of what your species has built. Why did you stop here?" It was, I thought, the first genuinely intelligent question she had asked since I arrived. "Because that was never what this was about," I said. "You wanted a demonstration, Princess. I gave you one. But I did not come here to destroy your empire. I came here to make certain that no human colony, ever again, gets glassed from orbit because someone wrote 4 careless pages calling it insignificant." I glanced toward Draven Kest as I said it, watching the words land exactly where I intended them to. "That message has been delivered," I said. "What you choose to do with it now is entirely up to you." The chamber remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over everyone present, human and Karathi alike. Somewhere far above us, I knew, a message was already spreading across 11 conquered worlds, across a dominion that had built its entire identity on being unbeatable, and across a single small blue planet that had spent 11 years waiting, patiently and quietly, for exactly this moment. Saren Val, princess of an empire that had never once lost a war, stood in front of her own throne, looking, for the first time in her long and comfortable life, genuinely uncertain of what would happen next. It was, I thought, a good place for her to finally begin learning. The Aran's Wrath remained motionless, in orbit for 11 hours after the broadcast ended, its systems quietly returning control to Karathi hands only once every camera, every recording device, every open channel to the 11 conquered worlds had confirmed the message was already far beyond anyone's ability to take back. I had never intended to keep the ship disabled longer than necessary. The point had never been to strand Saren Val or her crew, or to hold an entire flagship hostage for leverage. The point had been simple, almost painfully simple once it finally landed, to show, in a single unmistakable moment, that the Empire's confidence had always rested on an assumption nobody had ever bothered to test. By the time systems returned to Karathi control, the Emperor himself, Thal Korath, had already requested a private channel with the human delegation. Owen Marsh took that call, not me, because some decisions were his to make, and I had never intended to take that from him. I stood beside him instead, quiet, present, no longer performing calm because I no longer needed to. The Emperor did not apologize. Empires like his rarely do, not directly, not in the language humans would recognize as an apology. But he did something almost as significant. He acknowledged, in careful diplomatic terms broadcast to his own people as clearly as to ours, that the Dominion's assessment of humanity had been incomplete, and that a full review of contact protocols with our species would begin immediately. It was not justice. 9,000 names could not be balanced by a review of protocols, and I never expected them to be. But it was a beginning, and after 11 years of quiet, patient work, a beginning was more than Ashfall had ever promised itself it would achieve. Saren Val requested to speak with me alone, 3 days later, before our delegation departed for Earth. I did not have to agree. Owen Marsh told me plainly that I was under no obligation to grant a private audience to the woman who had given me a public countdown to what she believed would be my execution, broadcast to 11 worlds for the specific purpose of humiliating my entire species. I agreed anyway. She met me in a smaller chamber near the ship's observation deck, without guards, without the shimmering robes of the audience 3 days earlier. She looked younger without them, and far more tired, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent several days rebuilding an understanding of the universe from the ground up. I have spent 3 days trying to understand what I actually saw, she said, without any of the performance that had filled her voice during the audience. My advisors tell me your species is dangerous. My father tells me your species is patient, which he says is worse. I would like to hear it from you. We're neither of those things exactly, I said. We're a species that learned, the hard way, what happens when you let someone else decide how much you're worth. She considered that for a long moment, looking out at the stars through the observation window, the same stars that had once carried her empire's ships toward a small farming colony that had never done anything to deserve what happened to it. I called you insignificant, she said quietly. In front of every world I rule, I gave you 60 seconds because I believed, completely, that 60 seconds was more time than your species deserved. You did, I agreed. I was wrong. It was not phrased as a question, and I did not treat it as one. I simply let the words sit in the quiet room between us, because some truths need space before they can be fully understood by the person saying them. You were wrong about the 60 seconds, I said eventually. You were wrong about a great many things concerning what happened at Meridian, and what happened at 10 other colonies your empire never bothered to remember by name. But I did not come here to tell you that you were wrong simply so you could feel it and move on. I came here so that the next time your empire meets a species it has not yet studied properly, someone in that chamber remembers this moment and asks a better question before reaching for a countdown. She turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I had met her, there was nothing performative in her expression at all. Just a young woman, heir to an empire built on 3 centuries of unchecked confidence, beginning to understand exactly how much that confidence had cost people who had never been given the chance to matter. What happens to General Kest? She asked. The reports he wrote, the colonies he dismissed. That's not my decision, I said. It never was. I did not come here for revenge against one officer who wrote careless pages about a war he never had to fight in person. I came here to make certain nobody in your empire ever again has the luxury of writing 4 careless pages about a species they have not actually bothered to understand. She nodded slowly, and something in her posture shifted, some small but genuine weight settling into place. I gave you a minute, she said quietly. I meant it as an insult. I meant it to show every world watching exactly how little I believed you were worth. I know. What would you have said, she asked, if I had actually meant it? If there had been no countdown you controlled, if that minute had genuinely been the last one you were given. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it, because she deserved an honest answer, even now, even after everything. I would have told you the truth, I said. That humanity does not measure what we are worth by how much time someone else is willing to give us. We learned that lesson at Meridian, watching a sky that should have been blue turn orange in the middle of the afternoon. We learned it from people who had exactly as much time as you gave me, and less warning, and no countdown they controlled at all. And every single one of them mattered, Princess, whether your empire ever bothered to write their names down or not. She was quiet for a long time after that, looking back out at the stars, and I let her have the silence, because some understandings cannot be rushed, and I had already waited 11 years for this exact moment. A few more minutes cost me nothing at all. "I will remember Meridian," she said finally. "Not as a footnote, not as 4 careless pages. I will make certain the names are recorded properly, in our own archives, alongside everything else my empire has chosen to forget over 3 centuries of conquest. It will not undo what happened. I understand that, but it is what I can offer, and I would like you to know that I intend to offer it honestly." "That's a good place to start," I said. We did not become friends, not exactly, not in the way that word usually means. But something had shifted between us in that quiet observation chamber, something that had nothing to do with empires or countdowns or broadcasts watched by 11 worlds, and everything to do with 2 people who had both, in very different ways, spent their lives learning exactly how much a single miscalculation could cost. 3 days later, our delegation departed the Aran's Wrath for the long journey home. Owen Marsh spent most of that journey working through the diplomatic fallout of what had happened, drafting careful messages to Earth's government, preparing for a future that suddenly looked very different from the one anyone had expected when we boarded that ship. I spent most of it simply looking out at the stars, thinking about a wheat field that no longer existed, and a sister who had pulled me toward a storm shelter 11 years earlier, certain, in that moment, that we were about to lose everything. We had lost a great deal that day. I never pretended otherwise, not to myself, not to anyone who asked. But we had also built something in the years since, quietly and patiently, out of exactly the kind of desperation that empires like the Karathi Dominion had never learned to respect, because they had never needed to. They would learn to respect it now, not because I had destroyed their ship, or humiliated their princess, or proven, in a single dramatic moment, that humanity could match them force for force. I had done none of those things, and I never intended to. I had simply shown them, in front of every world they had ever conquered, that the countdown they believed they controlled had never actually been theirs to give. Saren Val had looked at me across that throne room and told every camera in the Dominion that I would be gone in a minute. She had no idea, standing there in her shimmering robes, with her violet eyes full of certainty, that the only thing about to disappear in that room was the last 3 centuries of her empire's assumption that it would never have to answer for what it had chosen to forget. I think about that moment often, even now, not with anger, not anymore, though there was a great deal of anger in me for a long time after Meridian burned. I think about it instead with something quieter, something closer to a promise finally kept, made by a boy in a storm shelter who did not yet understand that the sky turning orange would one day become the reason an empire learned, for the very first time in 300 years, to be afraid of exactly the wrong thing. They had spent 3 centuries measuring strength in ships and weapons and conquered worlds. They never once thought to measure it in patience. That was their mistake. It was always going to be their mistake, from the very first moment their ships passed over a small farming colony and decided, without asking a single question, that nothing there was worth remembering. We remembered anyway. We always will.